mute, wasn't it? Okay. Thanks for that nice warm introduction, Faith. The session today, we're meeting here to discuss the relationships among scholarship, research, and this thing called work-integrated learning or work-integrated education. That's the focus, and hopefully today's activities will be very much about having a conversation with you, the panel members, etc. What we're going to do is present ideas from myself, but also the panel members. On my immediate right, we have Ruth Bridgestock from Griffith University, and she has an institutional role with the implementation of work-integrated learning. Journalism, and then there's myself. The idea is that I'm going to make a few opening comments, and then each of the three panel members will stand up and speak, or can sit down and speak should you wish, for 5 minutes, and then we've got an open discussion. Half hour or so, we want to talk about what focuses on scholarship and research can be enacted in and for work-integrated learning or work-integrated education in our community here. Okay, so let me just make some opening comments. I think it's worthwhile to consider the nature of research and scholarship within work-integrated learning under three titles here. Conceptual explorations, how it allows us to think about things. Procedural appraisals, how to improve provisions, how to make those provisions better, educational provisions better, how to innovate, and then how to evaluate them, and then also implications for policy, albeit at an institutional level or governmental level or whatever. So there are three headings that I thought I would speak on very quickly. And I'll just make sure I've got something which indicates my time here. Okay, so in terms of conceptual exploration, I think that the very fact that we're considering how people learn in different kinds of social and physical environments, A, the workplace, and secondly, the educational settings, offers us some ways forward. Now, I just realised, and someone like myself is very interested in the relations between cognition and culture, that is, how particular kinds of learning arises from engaging in particular kind of activities. And the proposition is that we might learn things differently in an environment like this than when people are actually in a workplace undertaking work-related goal-directed activities. So it's interesting to, I think, understand those and understand the differences of learning that arises from participation in activities in either the work setting or else the educational setting. Now, while that's conceptual, it also goes to the heart of something which is pretty important about the educational project. And that is, we have scant knowledge of the way that particular activities lead to particular kinds of learning. I think we probably most know about that in detailed understandings of instruction for learning language and things like that. But the assumption really behind mass educational pedagogies will lead to particular kinds of learning, I think is very untested, and we don't know a lot about it, except that what we hear a lot of is dissatisfaction with the capacities that students have when they graduate and go into the workplace, and those complaints. So there's something there that we need to understand about the kinds of learning that arises from engaging in different kinds of social settings. There's also this concern that active learning involves making sense. Piaget referred to it as accommodation or simulation. People like Ray Smith over there refers to it as negotiation of how we engage in and reconcile the experiences we have. And this then suggests that there's a key focus on not only the provision of experiences that are provided by the university in the workplace, but how people come to experience those and learn through and from them. And there are important concepts arising. So, for instance, Ruth has referred to connectedness and connected pedagogies and principles behind how work-integrated learning can be understood. Denise Jackson from Edith Cowan has referred to pre-professional identity, the naive identity that people perhaps form about occupations before they actually have the opportunity to experience them directly. In my own work, early on in studies of work-integrated learning, came this idea of the agentic learner, the learner who has to be active and focused, seems to be important, particularly when the student is in the workplace and away from the close guidance of an educator. And then in a number of projects, and this issue keeps on coming back, that we talk about students being time poor, but the evidence that comes across a series of studies I've done, including the most recent, is that it's not time poorness, that our students are time jealous. And that is, they have demands upon their time and they have to make judgments about what they exercise, how they use their time and the effort they put behind it. And that can even be seen in time jealousy or time preciousness, if you want a sort of softer version of it. But it keeps on coming back in all the studies that I've been engaged with. And in terms of critiquing the discourse, I think it's always helpful to actually think about the terms that we use and make sure we're not using terms without critiquing them and about being clear about their meaning. And for instance, there's a considerable tradition of referring to experiences in workplaces as informal learning. And unfortunately, that has now entered the lexicon of UNESCO and OECD. And once it's in there, it never gets out. And so there's this concept, which to me doesn't make a lot of sense, informal learning. It's suggesting then that one's cognitive and sensory processes are somehow different in a situation which isn't a structured environment like this, educational environment like this, than in another circumstance. Also, another good example, by the way, is lifelong learning. If you look at a lot of the documents on lifelong learning, what it largely refers to is lifelong education. And that is the provision of experiences a lot like this where people are sitting in. And yet the government discourse around all of that is that this is lifelong learning when it's actually lifelong education, the provision of experiences. You say, well, what's the deal? Why is that a problem? The problem is that it often promotes a model of education very much premised on what we have here, people sitting in seats looking forward. And a model like that tends to deny all of the learning that goes on in adults' working life and in their community, family life, etc., because it tends to be captured in terms of institutional provisions. And it's within that recently I've been critiquing my own work and perhaps that of others in suggesting that much of what is discussed in the field is actually not about work-integrated learning. It's about work-integrated education. The two concepts are quite different. Education is the provision of experiences to achieve a particular kind of outcomes, intended outcomes in the main, whereas learning is something that people do, and they do so in terms of how they respond to the environment. And if you look at the list of concepts here, a lot of those are premised upon how the learner makes sense of things. So that I think it's timely now with this will agenda that we begin to tease out these ideas differently. Up until last Saturday, one of the reasons I thought it would be very, very important to do this is that it was mooted there would be significant reforms of the tertiary education system once Labour romped into Canberra. as you know, that didn't quite happen. And what I know is from my work history is that whenever there's massive educational reform, it focuses on institutions and institutional changes. And the thing that's often cast aside is the focus on learning. And when there's massive institutional change goes on, such as we're being mooted, it would all be about institutional changes, mass provision of experiences, and learning, I think, would be a lesser priority. In work I've done, I don't want to take too much time on this, in looking at the provision of work-integrated learning, work-integrated education in Australia, there have been a number of projects, and these are some of the things that have come from that. The important relations amongst the intended curricula, what's supposed to happen, what happens when it's implemented, and by the way, we don't only have time-jealous students, we also have time-jealous teachers, all of you folk here. And by the way, we also have resource-jealous workplaces that are very careful about how they allocate their resources for the students that they want, they're being asked to take. And in this handout here, I brought some of them. There's a set of principles that came from studies about pedagogic practices before, during, and after work placement or work experiences. And this then opens up a consideration of how we evaluate these experiences. Do we focus on the intents? Do we focus on the experience curriculum, the sense that the students make of it? And also the issue of equity has come to the fore. When you have an entire education provision which is managed and organised through education institutions, you can do things to ensure that the experiences that students have, are equitable, fair and reasonable and accessible to everybody. But when those experiences occur in workplaces, you lose control of that, and so there'll be different experiences which may not allow issues of equity to be exercised, whether that's the difficulties that international students sometimes have, or the kind of demands that can make it difficult for particular kinds of students, for instance those with family responsibilities, to engage in, etc. So the fact that you have these experiences beyond the bounds of the institution bring in other issues. And also issues of assessment. When we have assessment where you have the whole process highly controlled and you can manage processes of validity and reliability through having everybody doing the same exam, the same assessment, that of course goes out the window when you have very different experiences that students are engaging with. So how do you equate those experiences? How do we try and find measures of reliability in judgments about students when they've had quite different experiences? They've all sat very different exams, so to speak. But this actually allows us to, this process also allows us to explore a whole range of procedural concerns about how we can provide experiences for students. This list here is a list of projects which are in a recent book that came from the OLT grant that I organised recently, last couple of years, actually last 4 years, I think it's gone on forever. And these are a series of projects. The first round were in healthcare. Those that are in red there are actually good old Griffith Reds there, so you can see which ones they were. And there you'll see that there was particular focuses across nursing, medicine, physiotherapy, midwifery, nursing, medicine, dietetics, etc., etc., etc. And there was different kinds of interventions. What this project was about was when students come back from their work placements, how we can help them reconcile the experiences they've had to achieve the kind of outcomes that they want and the course wants, etc. And so that there was all these different ways in which we can try and find the best ways of providing enrichment or augmentation for students' experience. Similarly, I'm about to finish, in the next tranche of projects, which will be published in 2020. Again, and these are ones outside of healthcare, a whole set of different interventions across different areas and different approaches to trying to provide experiences for students once they've returned to the educational setting so that they can enrich the learning experiences they have. That is also intended in some way to try and even out the experiences and to provide other kinds of, vicariously provide experiences which the individual students won't have had. Okay, and then in terms of policy focus, just a few things here. The whole issue of employer and workplace engagement seems to be important, and mature approaches to engaging with employers in a partnership about providing students with experiences, and credit arrangements that do justice to the kinds of experiences that students have. Recently I was talking to a very well-established nursing school in Melbourne, and many of their students do part-time paid work, which is being a care assistant in the hospital, and that is being a visitor to patients. And through that they would learn a whole pile of skills of engagement, communication, a whole pile of stuff, but there's no credit arrangements for it. They just do it, it sits outside the course. Yet I would have thought that would have developed a whole set of foundational skills which are important for nurses. So I think we need to open up our considerations of the kind of credit arrangements for work placements. And as the shift increasingly, and I think that's going to intensify, for making our graduates job ready, that's a big shift. And I don't think it's easy for people, whoever, to say we want to shift to for tertiary education institutions to make their graduates job ready. The project of tertiary education has largely been about preparing people for occupations. Now all of a sudden it's shifted to making them job ready. That is, having the specific set of skills to be effective in the place that they find employment. That's a very different kettle of fish than working towards a set of nationally agreed occupational competencies. I actually think it's not a bad shift, actually, because it focuses on adaptability and the basis by which the knowledge that we prepare for our students needs to be adaptable to different circumstances. But that implies, rather than being directed towards achieving national competency outcomes or national professional statements, it's got a strong emphasis on learning processes within it, so that the knowledge that is learned is also to be, how is that knowledge applied in other circumstances, the one that you have learned it in. So I think that, it seems problematic, but I think there's also something in it which is inherently part of the educational project. And funding models that can accommodate practicum arrangements, and we won't get held up in that, and blah-de-blah, blah-de-blah, blah-de-blah. Okay, so we will finish.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Hello, everybody. I just want to check, can you hear me? There's a microphone down here, but it looks very potentially ineffective. I'll turn this one this way. Okay, how does that sound? It's good? All right. To commence my 5 minutes, a very brief introduction about me. Yes, I'm Ruth Bridgestock. I've been here at Griffith University now for nearly a year, in a role which partly encompasses being chair of the Griffith University Employability Committee. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the relationship between work-integrated learning and employability as part of my 5 minutes. But I've been kicking around in the research and scholarly space for quite some time. Specifically around things like graduate employability, which of course has work-integrated learning infused throughout it. I'm a fan of work-integrated learning and of work-integrated education. I would situate my broader practice in thinking about how individual learners, how educators and how educational institutions can position themselves optimally to move productively into the future. So I do a lot of writing in that kind of space as well. But what I'm going to be talking about today is essentially what I've put down as evidencing the impact of will through research and scholarship. Or put another way, providing a rigorous answer to the question, how do we know that will is making a difference to learners? And then using that answer to inform and persuade around things like curriculum choices, resourcing, including human resourcing for work-integrated learning. So, key question, how do we know that will is making a difference to learners? It's possible to disappear down any number of fruitful and very interesting rabbit holes when it comes to this question. So, what kind of will are we talking about? Is it placements, internships, projects, simulations? Could be any number of things. What sort of length of will makes a difference? Is it learning activities? I mean, Stephen was talking just before about post-practicum experiences, pre-practicum experiences, during practicum experiences, assessment. How does that make a difference? What about will inside versus outside the curriculum? What sort of learners are we talking about? Stephen again talked a little bit about equity issues here. And then what does will making a difference entail? So making a difference to what? So there's scholarship and literature out there, of course, which engages with work-integrated learning as linked with various indicators of student success and engagement, well-being, and so on. But the big one that we keep on coming back to is graduate employability. And I want to really engage with that one today. This idea that, you know, work-integrated learning in various ways increases learners' work and workforce readiness. I believe that this kind of argument, this linking of work-integrated learning and employability very explicitly, is timely. Now, the reason is, I mean, first of all, we're looking at performance-based funding for Commonwealth-supported places in universities, and so university leadership is really looking very strongly at these key performance indicators, employment outcomes. We have a QUILT website, so Quality Indicators of Learning and Teaching, that encourages potential students to compare institutions on the basis of employment outcomes. Also, I keep on having conversations with DVCs. I had one with my DVCA yesterday. I keep on asking them during these conversations, what would you say would be your top priority in terms of learning and teaching at your particular institution? And they tend to give me a wide range of answers, and then eventually it will boil down to graduate employability. So my point is here that will practitioners are really well positioned to make arguments around work-integrated learning, linking it with graduate employability, and then making certain sorts of persuasive arguments in terms of positioning will well in the curriculum and arguing around resourcing and support for work-integrated learning. So within this, I mean, I think that we should all be wheeling out national data with respect to will and employability. So I just want to briefly mention a national study. There's a few of them. By, again, you mentioned Denise Jackson just before, by Denise Jackson and Collings in 2018 in higher education. So they did analysis of the graduate outcome survey data and linked very explicitly placement experiences with short-term graduate outcomes, with positive graduate outcomes. They also linked work-integrated learning with less underemployment. So those graduates who engaged with placements during their programs ended up in higher quality graduate level employment, or they're more likely to than their peers. And there's a range of studies that explore specific dimensions of this. So the mechanisms for this, so things like specific disciplinary, professional, transferable capabilities, professional career identity, capability development, sort of understanding of work and work contexts. A lot of my work's been around social and professional capital and cultural capital, of course. Okay, so I've got 2 more points. Is that okay if I finish? Yep. At the level of the course, it's entirely possible. And in fact, I'd encourage everybody, if you aren't already, I'm sure you are, to demonstrate and explore empirically the development of these more specific dimensions of employability through work-integrated learning. This kind of evaluation then becomes part of evidence-based practice. It can be used to persuade when used in conjunction with national data. And it also, of course, helps us to tweak and hone our own practice and our own curriculum. But in closing, I mean, I'll say I haven't entirely drunk the Kool-Aid here. And I don't believe that will is a silver bullet for graduate employment outcomes. There's evidence out there that will enhances certain sorts of capabilities and certain sorts of capitals. And that's what our research, I think, needs to be emphasising. And it's the kind of data that we need to be using in our arguments. But in terms of employment outcomes, the first thing to say is that if everybody's doing well, it stops being a differentiating factor for learners. Of course. It means that, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing it. It means that more students are having effective learning experiences, so we should keep doing it and find other ways of demonstrating the value. The second thing to say, and this is my final point, is that there are other influences when you're looking at graduate outcomes that are actually more salient than educational experiences, including will, in determining graduate outcomes. And that includes things like labour market factors. So if you're a graduate nurse looking for a job, but there are no jobs out there for graduate level nurses, it doesn't matter how skilled you are or whether or not you've done work integrated learning. And this is why I think we need to be really emphasising in our research and our scholarly practice, looking at the development of skills, capabilities, and those forms of capital in order to build persuasive arguments around work integrated learning. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you. Carsten.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. Yeah, g'day. So my name is Carsten Zegwart, and I'm the Director of the Cooperative Education at Science Engineering at the University of Waikato. And that's the program that oversees the work placement program for science and engineering and for computer sciences. At least that's the position I'll hold for another week or so, and after then a new institutional structure will roll out, and I have new titles which I don't know yet what they will be. Now this new institutional structure that's rolling out is in response to a curricular enhancement project that we completed at our university, where we've made work integrated learning compulsory for all students that are on undergraduate level, studying at undergraduate level. And that was compulsory for all students enrolling in their first year last year. And most likely they'll be doing their work integrated learning experience in their third year, which is next year. So for us, next year is going to be a really big year. It's either all going to work or it's some of it maybe not. Challenges we'll see. As we were developing these things, we were looking very much at what the literature was telling us when it came to best practice. What was the current thinking about what was good practice for work integrated learning? What was work integrated learning, or what is work integrated learning? Is it just placements? Is it more than that? And our argument is it's definitely more than that. So we've divided it up into 2 different types. So we have work integrated learning that is work placements, and that we refer to as being full immersion, high impact type of work integrated learning experience. And then we have the work-related type projects. So these are projects that have an external partner, but they're not necessarily based in the workplace. So we've defined it in those 2 different types of work integrated learning, but lots of different types of practices that sit below that. Stephen, in his presentation, made a lot of references to research that's already out there, and Ruth likewise referred to research as well. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that, is that work integrated learning is a legitimate learning approach. And as any learning approach in university, it must be, as a fundamental principle of university education, that it must be research informed. And work integrated learning should be no exception to that. The practice of work integrated learning must be informed by research. Now we're in a very fortunate position that there is a lot of research happening in this space. It has advanced a lot. there's a lot of research that is now literature, and a lot of the research is now very much research and theory informed, which has been very encouraging. I remember Bartkus and Stoll did an analysis of research in that was conducted in the 80s, and a lot of that research was based in the US. It was very practitioner focused, which is good. I mean, that's where they were at that time, but it wasn't so much theory-informed research. But since then, we've seen a significant shift in the research activities that is occurring. And I must say, a lot of the research that's occurring in work integrated learning is happening here in Australia at the moment. If you were to say where the centre of research for work integrated learning is, it's over here, which is, again, you're in a very fortunate position to have that. Now, it's important that our own practices are informed by our own research too. And this will be my encouragement, that as you build your programs up and as you engage in enabling learning through work integrated learning, that you research that practice as well. And then for the benefit of students and for others and for yourself as well as career-wise, you want to be publishing that research too. And it's just important to engage in that. I'll leave it at that. And no doubt there'll be more questions later on about publishing research, and I'll be looking forward to that. But research-informed education is a fundamental principle that we must adhere to when it comes to work integrated learning. And there's lots of exciting opportunities in that space. Thank you.
Jackie.
Hello, can you hear me out there? Yes, fantastic. So I just have to say I've had the dreaded lurgy that's now turned into an inner ear infection and a chest infection. So I'm just hoping I can get through 5 minutes without having a coughing fit. So first of all, I'd like to just give a bit of background about me and my involvement in work integrated learning. And it probably comes from a little bit of a different perspective. I'd also like to say thanks to Faith for inviting me to this event. Faith and I got chatting about the many fantastic projects around work integrated learning that Faith has been involved in. And I'd said to Faith, well, you are doing research about these, aren't you? And we had that moment where we kind of realised that there had been a lot of opportunities that perhaps the group of journalism educators had missed, but certainly it meant going forward that we can capitalise on those opportunities. So thanks, Faith. So my background is I was a journalist and a crisis communications manager for over a decade. So I went from the light side, which we call journalism, to the dark side, which we call corporate communications. And I learnt a lot in that course. Then I became an academic. I've been an academic for 22 years, and I have worked across journalism, media studies, communication. Don't tell anyone, but I also have a master's in Aboriginal studies. So I've worked across a pretty kind of broad range of areas. And in all of those areas, there has been some component of work integrated learning. And for me as an academic, that's been really important, particularly around these kinds of really industry-orientated degrees where people are going out to get very specific roles. Of course, the challenge that we now face as journalism educators, not so much in corporate communication, because that area is just exploding, but as journalism educators, our problem is every morning I get up and I hold my breath when I open up the Sydney Morning Herald or the ABC, and I think, how many are they sacking today? How many journalists are going to lose their jobs? So this challenge means that in terms of work integrated learning, particularly in the journalism field, we now need to find new ways and new places to send our students. But I don't look at this as a woe is me moment. I don't, that's really not in my nature. So what I look at it as is this is a really fantastic opportunity to skill up students to become entrepreneurial journalists, to set up their own websites, to set up their own businesses, to go and work in areas that we have yet to kind of see develop within journalism. So I will come back to some of these points later on in our discussion, no doubt. But one thing I had spoken to Faith about is what might work integrated learning research look like, particularly around our area going forward. And more importantly, what would drive some people to actually start to undertake research into the kind of world projects that they were running. And I know there's a question coming up about that later on, but I won't steal your thunder, Stephen. I just want to talk really briefly about this other interesting angle, if I can. I won't go on for too long. The voice is holding up, which is great. I was involved in a 4-year project called Reporting Islam, and that involved training over 1,000 journalists, journalism educators and students around Australia in how to be more informed when it comes to reporting those issues. And along the way, I have to say thanks to the wonderful Learning Futures people who were heavily involved in that. But along the way, I realised that that was another form of work-integrated learning. And we've had some fantastic outcomes from that. We embedded research into that from the very beginning, and there are about 14 fantastic data sets. And we did pre and post testing to see whether they actually learnt anything. Then we matched that with 3 national social surveys where we asked Australians where they learn about, we asked non-Muslim Australians where they learn about Muslim Australians. So probably another interesting little take on learning, and yeah, so that's what I've been involved in, and I'm more than happy to talk a bit more about that project. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. Thank you. To commence the interaction, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to respond to a provocation, okay? And hopefully that will lead to fruitful discussion. I'll start with Karsten. Alexei Sales said, "We will never bring about world peace with just songs. You've got to have a dance as well." As an editor of a journal, it's not sufficient, is it, just to simply publish articles so that people get pubs and people get sites? What else should happen? What else should occur from your perspective as a journal editor?
Yes, no, I mean, I do believe publishing is important. It's a way of enabling knowledge to be made available to the wider audience. But publishing by itself is it's not enough, as Stephen's saying. We want to see that knowledge that is published put into practice. So we want to see it being used on an everyday basis. We want to see it being built upon for not a research project or something that gives us greater insight to what's actually happening around us. So publishing in itself, yeah, okay, it's important for our careers, and we are measured by that in an academic context. But building upon that knowledge and putting that knowledge into practice, that's where the real activity is. Yeah.
And what about what we talked about over lunch, about a community such as the one we're referring to in America?
Remind me, lunch.
AERA.
Oh, yes. Oh, it's Stephen and I were talking at lunchtime around a community of practitioners and gathering together and sharing ideas. And we were talking about the context of conferences. And I think both Stephen and I were talking about conferences and the presentations that have been presented at conferences, as interesting as they are. It's actually the interactions as part of a network and a community that really matters. I increasingly find the gathering together as a professional family, and then sharing ideas and challenging ideas and being together in the same physical space more important than the actual presentations itself. It's not to say the presentations aren't important, they're still important, and that's what enables the event to actually occur, but it's that networking, it's that community that is so important. So, I think virtually all of my research collaborations that I've had over the many years have all come from people I've met via conferences and the networking activities as such.
Thanks, Karsten. Jackie, you're a journalist and you're a journalist educator. Most journalists I know actually learnt their craft in journalism workplaces. Barry Cassidy, for instance, who's about to retire, talks about his experience. Okay. So let me ask you a question. Should we be focusing not so much on work-integrated learning or work-integrated education, but education-integrated work?
Yes, and that's really back to the Reporting Islam project. That's what we were doing there. So as a bit of background, I was one of the poor people who did a cadetship, as well as a degree part-time over 6 years. So I suffered through, quite lowly paid positions there for a while. But I have to say the combination of the two, the on-the-job experience and going to university, I think it made me a much better journalist than I would have been if I hadn't had either of those experiences. So short answer to your question is yes, we probably should be focusing on that, but maybe that real idea about how do we kind of get a combination of the experiences that I went through for people now, because I do really believe that made me a better and a stronger journalist and a better academic, actually. Yeah.
Just say why?
I had the benefit of the wise heads in the newsroom to tell me, you know, how I should write a lead, how I should interview people, take them to the pub. No, probably not a good idea. That was a practice years ago, I have to say, not a good one. But as well as the kind of wise heads in the newsroom who had a lot of experience and could share that, I then had the benefit of going to a university and learning about the theory that underpins some of these ideas and being able to actually have a much broader view and understand, well, why is it that people behave in this way and what drives people? So that really then informed the way I went about doing interviews and the way I went about writing stories.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you.
Ruth, you have corporate responsibilities for work integrated learning here at Griffith. What kind of ways can scholarship and research present work integrated learning to be as attractive to key leaders as, for instance, the key focus on everything being electronically mediated?
Yes, good question. So I think in my response to that, I'm going to hark back to my slightly more than 5-minute introduction. I'm going to say that it's important to be able to present empirical evidence of impact on student learning. At the highest level of institutions, university councils and so forth, they are driven by KPIs. And so if we keep our eyes on KPIs around things like student satisfaction and graduate outcomes, for better or worse, however you feel about those indicators, we can have another discussion about that later on, and then you link your practice with demonstrable outcomes in those spaces and make an argument and band together and make arguments, then you can be really very persuasive. I think at an institutional level, it's important to be able to make these arguments and this engagement at multiple levels. So at the top level, a different set of arguments may well fly to those at maybe at head of school kind of level. But you're going to need to line up all of those institutional supports in order to enhance the engagement with work integrated learning, enhance resourcing, whatever it is that you're after.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, over to you. So we'll ask for questions, and by the way, the panel can ask questions of each other as well. So do we have any questions that lead from the presentations or the discussions then? Faith, to start things off. And we'll have people with microphones.
So I guess my question is, as a junior academic within an institution who gets lumped with work integrated learning, I'm not bitter, no, just kidding. When you look at career progression, will kind of has a dirty connotation attached to it because you're not research intensive or you're not producing the kind of research outputs that academics who progress more rapidly are, because work integrated learning is work intensive if you're actually doing it well. So how do you start reconciling a research 40-40-20 profile where if you've got work integrated learning as part of your suite of courses, how do you kind of, is it about changing institutional perceptions of work integrated learning? Is it about, like Jackie says, kind of combining the work integrated learning within a research framework? How do you, as a panel of experts, how do you suggest we start approaching that?
Okay. Would somebody like to lead into that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sure. why
I'll
not?
go next.
Yeah,
Yes.
you go next. Yeah, hey, look, that's a really good question. And you mentioned the 40-40-20 model, and I always thought it was more like an 80-80-40 model. I think most of us probably relate to that. I started off in the faculty of, the School of Science, as it was called back then, and I carved out a career in work integrated learning. And the way I was able to do that is that I made work integrated learning my research profile. And I developed and I published and I researched my practice and I published further from that. And that became the profile of what I had. Now, it did make me stand out quite unusual in the School of Science because my research was not science. It was science education in the context of science education. And there was some difficulty around recognition of that. But I've always been quite fortunate to have a dean who was able to recognise that and reward accordingly. Do I think I'm lucky in that sense? Yes, I think I am. I think there's a lot of examples out there where that same recognition is not given, and it is a struggle, and there does need to be institutional cultural change around that. But I think as work integrated learning continues to raise its profile more and more, I think that recognition will start to come through. But my encouragement to you would be make work integrated learning your research focus, and whatever context that you're in, it's just a context within you do the research for work integrated learning.
Is when you do start getting some publications about your work integrated learning, it's kind of dismissed as teaching and learning scholarship or education. So there's some kind of perceptions within some academic circles that it's not quality research, it's more teaching and learning, and it doesn't really bode well for DECRA or ARC grants or those kinds of research tracks.
I think some of my science colleagues probably raised their nose a little bit at work integrated learning research, but having said that, it's educational research. And I often tap into the Faculty of Education and use the support structures around there in order to get some of the recognition, but also the awareness of what's happening in that space. Pass over to you if you like.
Well, actually, I want to pass over to Stephen because he's held quite a few ARC grants in work integrated learning. He's nationally and internationally renowned as a scholar in this space. He's clearly carved out a successful career. So, do you have any tips for us?
That's a good point.
Yeah. I think the ideal is that you're actually engaging in scholarship in the areas that you teach in. And I think there's flow between those. That the things that you're teaching, you develop scholarship, and then that also brings the service in because you engage with people doing that. So that's the happy marriage when all those things come together. And I know it's easy to say it because it doesn't play out for everybody, but I think that's a goal to work towards, to see scholarship. I mean, I'm pretty sure that if you were to get published in a high-ranking journal, such as Studies in Higher Education or Higher Education, something like that, nobody would be batting an eyelid and saying that's, So I think there's issues. I do know the problem, and I know the problem that Kirsten's referring to because I was involved in the ERA exercise, and we have colleagues in science trying to bat anything that's associated with education over to education, and then we promptly bat it back, because it's often in low-tier journals. It's not doing us any good. And so there is I think somebody like in science probably has a bigger problem, I think, than in our group, I suspect. But I think it's this bringing together the scholarship in your teaching, in your research. I think that's the way, if nothing else, to try and manage this 80-80-40 life we're all supposed to be managing. But anyway, I'll throw to Jackie.
I've got a comment on that. I think it's always about how we talk about these things. So instead of perhaps talking ourselves down if we're doing this kind of research, we need to speak up to the higher people about how important this is, because it is actually the livelihood of the university. The students are the livelihood of the university. There does seem to be a strange conversation that happens, and I'm sure you've all heard it. Sometimes we're told that research is far more important than the students are. Other times it'll be the students are more important because we're worried about retention. So we do have these kind of conflicting conversations that go on. But as a former PR person, as a crisis communications manager, it really is up to us to start to speak very differently about the kind of research that we're doing, or that mostly you're doing in this space, because that will start to shift, that will start to help the cultural change happen, and that needs to happen not always from the top down, it sometimes needs to happen from the bottom up. So yeah, think really carefully about how you speak about your research. It's not just scholarship of teaching, it is actually research.
And just one qualification, I mean, I think it's very sad that we've lost the OLT, or the ALT as it was in the Carrick Institute, because that provided a strong national focus on scholarship of teaching and learning, which the universities were very accommodating of, because it brought in competitive funds. So the loss of that institution has clearly made it more difficult for people in your circumstance. I think that's got to be said. It was easier for me when there was those options available. Other questions, please. Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Shifting the conversation a little bit back to some of the conceptual stuff, particularly Ruth, some of the stuff that you're speaking about, and in relation to some of the comments that Stephen said. Ruth, you drew a very strong link between will and graduate employability, and you interchanged between employability and employment, and I understood why you were doing that. But the stuff that I've read from yourself, Stephen, has been very heavily focused around learning qualities that sit beyond the nature of employability.
Yep.
And what I'm grappling with is that the notion of employability and will is only a relatively recent phenomena. It's really taken hold in the last 10 years, yet the notion of will and more generally experiential education has been around for a century or longer. I'm just wondering if you could sort of explore a little bit more in depth that reconciliation of whether or not work integrated learning has greater learning benefit beyond just employability, and if so, what would be some of the questions or some of the things that we should be interrogating in that space?
Oh, great question. Love it. So the first thing to say here is that I actually define employability very broadly indeed. So I do not synonymise employability with employment outcomes, although I'm pragmatic and I say, okay, this is a reality. But everybody's looking at this particular KPI. Others conceptualise graduate employability around it being things like professional readiness. My particular take on employability is quite like Dawn Bennett's, and she talks about graduates being able to employ their abilities across a range of different contexts. So I think of employability as being about the graduate's ability to successfully navigate and be productive in a variety of different, increasingly complex contexts in life. The extent to which work integrated learning or experiential learning in a broader kind of sense sets the learner up for contributing to life and work and having meaningful life and work, I think is the way that I engage with it. I mean, I know that there's sort of a broader constellation of benefits of will and experiential learning beyond that. I think I alluded to a couple of them, things around student success and so forth, but I think perhaps Stephen is better placed to talk about those. Would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. Firstly, the term employability, how I view it, employability, is it's not just, as Ruth was saying, the skills to secure employment upon graduation, but rather it's the capacity to remain employed across working life as circumstances change. And that really, for most people, begins on day one you get a job, because that's when you're confronting changes. The ability to adapt from one circumstance, albeit an educational setting, and if you have had a practicum experience, it's very likely that the place you'll find yourself working in is quite different than that one, so you've got to adapt. I think that's central to, as I was saying earlier, the educational project, which is about providing learners with outcomes that are not restricted to the circumstances of their initial learning. Hence the focus on adaptability, hence the focus on agentic learners. Students who need to understand that it's their responsibility to learn, and that when they engage in working life, they have to play part of that role of being active, active learners. I think there's a difference. Where do I start? This whole thing about adaptability, we can look at the history of it, and there is a view that there was such thing called generic skills, key competencies, and the most recent one is 21st century skills. The evidence is very clear that there are some general capacities that do transcend different fields, but they tend to be fairly abstract, like look before you leap, think before you act. But that's not terribly helpful when you're dealing with problems of the kind. And the evidence is fairly clear that when you have a domain of knowledge, such as journalism, that you're competent in, you then have the capacity to adapt that to another journalist situation, albeit print media or another kind of media. So, you know, as a consideration of the foundational knowledge, the canonical knowledge of the occupation, which is the basis for adaptation, but that will only come if we have educational processes in place which press students to think about other circumstances. This might be very surprising for some of you folk here, but I used to work in the clothing industry, and believe it or not, I was called a clothing designer. Yeah, you can see I've really carried that on. And when I went from the clothing industry to being working in TAFE as a teacher of fashion, it was called. I never felt comfortable with that identity. But in clothing, in the TAFE system, we had to teach students what are called informed principles. And that is how to make patterns for garments, because there's no point in teaching students about the garments that are in the shops today, because by the time they graduate, they're in the recycle shops. What you have to teach them is a set of principles about how you adapt to the current circumstances or the current requests. So something like stride room in a skirt, you know, a consideration of how you get stride room, but also what happens with different kinds of fabric. I think the example I used to talk recently is that a nice big stride room in a nice soft drapey fabric is one thing, but if you make it in 14-ounce denim, it'll end up looking like a tent. So it's those ideas that allow a person to adapt their occupational knowledge to another circumstance. But that is process stuff, and that is, you have to have a deliberate educational focus to achieve that outcome. And so I guess what I'm saying, Matthew, is that, you know, we tend to focus and have been asked to focus on the canonical knowledge of the occupation. What's a journalist supposed to do? What's an engineer supposed to do? What's a teacher supposed to do? And now we're being asked to how that occurs in different journalism situations, different engineering situations, and different teaching situations. And that if that's the case, if that's what we're being asked to do, we have to have curriculum and we have to have pedagogic practices which actually support that. And my view, rightly or wrongly, is that it's that kind of principled understandings which will assist people sustain their employability across working life, because we can be pretty certain that it's going to be constantly changing.
Agreed. Can I jump in very quickly in support of that? I agree very strongly with this sort of notion of sort of adaptation and adaptability. And in my work, I talk about translation rather than transferability of skills. So this sort of idea that you can develop capabilities within a classroom or within one workplace context, and then there is an explicit process of, okay, how does this work in another context? And being able to provide those principles and scaffolds for that, I think is very useful. There's another word that Stephen used there, which I think is really important, and that's identity. Because if the student is not thinking about the new context, or is not thinking about the possibilities beyond an existing experienced occupation or workplace, it's very difficult, I think, to support that translation or that adaptation. So I'm going to just chuck that in there and then run away. Yeah, identity.
I just have a question from somebody that's actually watching the live stream, Stephen Clark. He's just mentioned that he's interested to know how to construct and manage a WIL program in the context of distance education or online-only delivery in terms of accessibility in students.
Okay. Is that to anybody in particular, or?
No, it was just open to the panel.
Yes, would anyone like to?
I can't say that's my expertise. It's always been face-to-face for me.
I'm going to refer to one of my PhD graduates from New Zealand, a woman called Selina Chan. She works in the polytech system in New Zealand, and her students are bakery students. She was a baker, born in Singapore, learned her bakery skills in Singapore, went to live in New Zealand. Her apprentices, unlike perhaps here, are scattered around New Zealand, and she gets to meet with them maybe once or twice a year when they come to Christchurch for intense sessions. And Selina was incredibly prescient. This is going back 10, 15 years. She began using earlier versions of these things to actually engage with apprentices and put that as part of the approach, so that she would reach out and get them to share with that very basic technology at that point in time. So that she came up with a pedagogy and a curriculum process that was there to engage students and to get them to try and think about their practice from a distance. So I think there is strategy you can use. I mean, we have this stuff now which is probably better than ever with online and ways of doing things. It's also interesting, I should say, that the program which we've taught long in the area that I work in, adult and vocational education, we've done at a distance. We've always had students scattered around Queensland and other states, and now we have students in Singapore who are essentially doing a distance-based program. And there we use a combination of experiences, and that includes the kind of technologies we have now. What's the latest one, sorry? Blackboard, is it? No, anyway, shows I'm seriously out of touch. We also have email in contact with them, regular interactions via Skype or Zoom or whatever, and they also like the face-to-face things. And so I think there's a combination of experiences. What is certainly the case for adults, and I guess we're talking about adults there, is that what they say, I've got a large project in Singapore at the moment which is looking at that in a small country, but it's a country where people spend an hour a day going to and from work, and so they need to maximise their time. What those folks say is that the stuff on the online is great, but what they really like is meeting face to face. So I think it's a pedagogy that is about providing experiences, but also information and experiences, but also having face to face. And what those students, particularly ones from Singapore, are now telling us is the importance of the qualities of the teachers who facilitate those experiences, not doing what I'm doing now, and that is being didactic, but actually allowing the students to, when they come together, to engage and share. And whether it's distance that people need to engage, because of distance that people need to engage online, or whether it's simply the busy lives we need, I think it's that, perhaps that kind of combination which is one way forward. By the way, one interesting thing is coming through in this study in Singapore, and that is the question was raised, should attendance be compulsory? Because in Singapore you have to turn up and there's somebody ticking the boxes. And we thought that the people who would be most against that would be women with children. And they said no. They said, we want compulsory attendance because we have to be there, and we can tell our husbands, right, I'm going to be there, you're looking after the kids. So it's a good idea to actually find out from people who are participating as students what they need, rather than make assumptions on their behalf. Because they were saying that by making it compulsory, I have to be there, and he can look after the kids for that evening. So do you have you want to make a contribution to that? All right. Okay. Any other contributions to that?
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add to that is for work integrated learning programs where students are placed at distance, there is a lot of online contact. That might actually be the only contact that they have while they're on placement. But there's usually face-to-face beforehand and then face-to-face contact afterwards. But I am aware of and I had to scrape my memory banks where we had these discussions, but there is a research project taking place at the moment in South Africa where they're looking at full online contact for students on placement. There's no face-to-face contact before or after. And I did an analysis to determine that the students' experience and perceptions were around that. And they were finding very little difference between online contact and having face-to-face contact. Now, this research is still happening, and it would be really nice to see what the comparison actually is and what the support structures are. But there is work happening in that space, and it may be something that will grow more in the future. Yeah.
And if that person's got another query, we'll happily take it up. Thank you.
Thank you. I just had a question around industry partnerships and research with industry, and I think that's a strong focus for the university moving forward to really sort of validate a lot of our work as well. So I'm just curious about, and from your perceptions, how do we inform and educate industry about the value of will beyond employability? So thinking more than just we've got another student employed, fantastic, or it's of benefit to industry for them to have one of our students in place with them. So how do we start to work with them around that research piece?
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Jackie, thank you.
So we have a long history of having really strong industry contacts between both the journalism educators and various journalism industries, but also in the PR and corporate communication areas. So we've spent a lot of time, and I have to take my hat off to Faith, who spent a huge amount of time really expanding and strengthening those networks, along with our placement officers as well, going above and beyond, doing research projects, small research projects for them for nothing, so that they were getting something from us, and they were then quite happy to take our students. But they also began to get an understanding that universities are not just about sending students into the workplace, that they have people here who have skills that can actually help businesses improve, develop and grow, and particularly again in the journalism area, adapt to kind of changing situations. You know, the wave is just still coming, and it's just not going to stop in that particular industry. So those kinds of extras and relationship building can be really, really helpful when it comes to getting them to see the bigger picture. It's not going to happen overnight, and it didn't happen overnight for any of us, but we were really lucky because all of us in the journalism area here came from industry. So we already had really good contacts and really good you know, faith and trust in those people. So they knew who we were, they continue to know who we are, but we have also taken that and built new relationships with people. And I'll go back to the Reporting Islam project, which is a fantastic example of, we're going to open our newsrooms. You can come in and train our staff, and you can do research while you're at it. And by the way, we would really love to have a look at the results of that research. So we were sending results back to industry, you know, quick results saying, look, the training works. Once we were able to prove that, so it improved two things: knowledge, journalists' knowledge of Muslims and their faith, and their knowledge of best practice when it came to reporting stories about Muslim and Islam. So as soon as industry saw that, they went, okay, we've got 50 more newsrooms that we want you to go into to do this training, which then meant we had to hire more teams of people to do the training. So anyway, it's a long-term project, but giving extras really helps to kind of broaden their knowledge about what it's all about.
If I can add a little bit to that, we recently finished a small research project around why employers take students on in the first place, and it was true that most of the time they were looking at recruitment and as well as a way of recruiting potential graduates, but there was a real awareness that there were other benefits coming through as part of the research project as well. And one of the things that the employers particularly appreciated was having a student in the workplace, how they changed culture that was in the workplace. They were talking about having fresh ideas coming through. They were talking about having ability to build up their own staff into management type roles. You know, they manage the students, their first management type of experience, as a way of growing that employee's capabilities and their advancement potential. They were also talking about giving back. They believed it was important to give back to their own discipline by enabling a new generation of practitioners coming through and the professionals coming through. And we described it as being like a virtuous cycle. The group that we did the research on, they were themselves WIL graduates, and we wanted to know why they then became WIL supervisors, and it was that whole context of contribution to the wider discipline. So I think there is already a fair bit of awareness out there, but probably because we hear about employability all the time and employment outcomes and about recruitment, and recruitment is one of the motivators, but there is more to it than that.
Okay, I'd support everything that my fellow panellists have just said. My National Senior Teaching Fellowship was about this topic, well, broadly speaking. In it, I mean, it started being very much focused on building sort of industry and community partnerships for work-integrated learning, and very rapidly became about actually universities institutionally need to be better at building long-term reciprocal partnerships with those outside the university as well as those inside the university. So we ended up with two key metaphors, sort of a university as walled garden and university as a series of silos. And there's a whole bunch of work going on the ground that I discovered through my research that we all know about with, you know, academics and placement officers building relationships, sending students out and making sure that the relationships are good, and et cetera, et cetera. But at a higher and strategic level, it's actually quite rare to have sort of an institutional strategy that sort of integrates all of this and provides sufficient resourcing for these sort of longer and deeper relationships that are required. That include, you know, they go beyond learning and teaching to research and knowledge creation, to wider notions of engagement and so forth. And so that's what my fellowship ended up being about. It was saying, you know, big call to the university sector. How can we foster these wider and deeper long-term partnerships that are beneficial to both sides? We ended up with a bunch of toolkits and so forth, yeah, to deal with that. Mm.
Yeah, I think it's a real issue, and there are some sectors that are very used to taking students, such as healthcare, and many of those sectors are under real stress. It's probably about 5 or 6 years ago now that the New South Wales health system said that they would rank requests for practical experiences on the basis of whether the person's New South Wales resident, Australian, international student. And what I've heard of is that employers are saying, as was suggested from New Zealand, that employers are saying, I don't mind doing this to support young Australians and to give them a go sort of stuff. However, there's resentment of providing experiences without charge to international students who employers say, well, the universities are getting all this money from these people and we're supposed to provide this experience for them free. So there's a sort of an examination of this. To actually achieve the kind of outcomes that we're talking about, I think this requires cultural change. For instance, if we look in Germany, there's the Beruf concept, and that is a cultural valuing of skill, and that brings together the country in terms of parents' commitment to your children, because apprentices in Germany get paid about 20% of an adult rate, whereas here they get paid 70–80%. And that workplaces then feel that, you know, they're getting a person, the very level of cost is very low, that they feel strongly committed to the idea that they have to provide very, very good preparation. And this is a cultural sentiment. Whereas, for instance, in France, because of a product of French republicanism, there's a desire to separate education out from work. because work was seen as usurious, which brought about the Republic. And so in that situation, it's always been very difficult to bring together work and education. So it's a cultural change that needs to come. But the Beruf concept didn't just come from people happening to grow up in a place called Germany. Yes, there's been a valuing of craft and skills there for a long time, but it was really accentuated by the need for a country to reconstitute itself after a catastrophic war. But this is a very powerful concept. A colleague of mine, I've told this story a lot, in the German part of Switzerland says that when somebody becomes a Meister in a local village, a Meister is a person who gets a master's level qualification which allows them to supervise apprentices. It would be in the local newspapers. But if somebody got an MBA, it wouldn't be worth a mention. So there's a valuing of that. And I don't think that is the job of education institutions. I think that's the job of government, working with industry to actually elevate that. Because if education institutions try to do that, it'll be seen as being marketing, social marketing perhaps, but more likely taken as economic marketing. But I think there's the need for us to engage with the with industry partners, with enterprises, and try and assist them to understand the valuing of those skills and what they get out of it. My very limited experience of engaging directly with employers over educational matters is when you bring them in, they're quite taken by it. They're quite engaged in it. But it's not the case. It's top-down stuff that's done. So local engagement. I think, for instance, in my experience certainly in Queensland has been that there is a quality of engagement that comes in non-metropolitan communities which isn't evident in metropolitan communities, because in small regional communities, the local employers feel almost as though they have to take apprentices and have to engage because that's expected of them. Whereas that's, the enterprises in a large city like Melbourne or the Gold Coast aren't under such press. So I think it's a question of engagement, and I use the word mature in one of the earlier slides. And the idea of maturity in an educational system is that rather than this top-down stuff, that we actually have shared understandings, that it's not industry telling education what it should do, but a more reciprocal engagement where one learns from the other. And that comes from the mature models from Scandinavia, and also from the more mature models in the German-speaking parts of the world, Germany, Austria, and the German-speaking parts of Switzerland. I think it's that maturity of engagement that's important. A bit of a lecture. Okay, was there another question? Thank you. And then we'll move on to some questions about research.
Thank you, Stephen. This goes to just about everything we talked about, I think, already today, and that's the challenge of actually designing the work integrated learning experience itself with industry, whether that's in terms of research design for the research that you want to do later or collaboratively with that industry partner, or whether it's just the educational experience itself and the restraints and governance and assessment type related type activities that go with that. Do you know if there's any really relevant research going on in that type of area about co-collaboration with industry to define what those experiences should entail? With industry, whether that's in research design for the research that you want to do later or collaboratively with
I can only give a short answer. I think the answer is yes. I just can't quite remember where. No, there is research happening in that space, and certainly there's development happening in that space. There is a little bit of literature around it. There's a little bit in the journal around it. I'll have to go hunting a bit to see where those examples are, but we're quite happy to do that and then provide those references. Yeah.
Certainly in healthcare, there are a number of studies going about the way students engage, how that can be supported, and I'm sure probably people are aware that the cost to healthcare systems of having students is quite high, but at the same time, universities have to pay for it. And one of the issues is that in some instances, the amount of time that, for instance, nursing students spend in clinical settings has actually been reduced because of cost factors. Then you need to come up with strategies about how you can maximize the time for those placements. So that engages you in considering then how effective they can be. So one of the ideas behind the project I was talking about earlier was that because our students go perhaps to one kind of workplace, or if you're lucky maybe one or two, by trying to bring them together, they can share experiences of what happens in other kinds of workplaces. So this is how nursing occurs here, this is how nursing occurs there, this is what nursing, how it happens here, etc., etc. And there's a way then of sharing experiences, because we can't. I mean, the press for workplaces to provide all these experiences is becoming intense. What we can do is try and maximize the students' experience by not just augmenting them, but actually getting them to share them and to critique them and understand why a particular approach to nursing or whatever occurs in this workplace and why it's different over here and why it's different again. Because at the heart of that is developing not only the canonical knowledge of the occupation, but understanding the variations of it and why something is done different in work contexts. And there's often very good reasons behind it. And so I think that's, and if students are exposed to different ways in which the occupation is practiced, that helps open up their understandings. There's not just one way, there's different ways, and you can get behind that. So you can imagine, for instance, in a nursing program, when nursing used to be done in hospitals, that the nurses rotated around all the different student, well, what are called student nurses, what were they called? Trainees or whatever, all different wards. And that was great, they had lots of different experiences. But what needed to happen, I don't think did happen, is brought together and say, now what was common about nursing in all of those different wards? What was the same? What was the things you were doing? That's the canonical knowledge. And then what was different with an oncology ward, with a mental health ward, blah, blah. And that is the specific variations of it. So there's things that we can do as educators to enrich those experiences and try and offer a design that develops and focuses on adaptability, I think. Any more questions? We've got another slide here, which is about, just a set of open questions about identifying how scholarship and research can be enacted through and for work-integrated learning and education. And this then is three of them. What are the issues in your disciplinary area associated with providing and combining experiences in educational, that should be educational and work settings that would profit from further inquiry? Kind of processes and outcomes associated with WIE, WIL are those that are likely to attract interest of reviewers and editors in the field of higher education. So you can see those three questions were directed at our three panelists here. But the first one is, what are the key areas that you see as in your field as being important, and what needs to be understood so that we have an institutional, so this falls under Ruth's ambit, an institution-wide response to work-integrated learning, and then in what ways is that scholarship able to be engaged with so that we can advance this field through journals focusing on higher education, curriculum, pedagogy, and also policy formation. And I mean, I think if you look in perhaps the key journal of educational policy, JEP from the United Kingdom, I bet you would not find one article on this stuff in it. I haven't looked, but but I'd be pretty confident about that because it's all about schools, what happens in schools. So there's that there. So does this prompt any your responses or prompt responses from the panel? Apart from the fact that I can't spell and I repeat words apart from that. Thank you. Just here. And then okay, go ahead, please.
All right. Thank you, guys, so far. I am a nurse, so obviously we situate quite significantly within the work integrated learning process. And I think probably having been I'm also doing my PhD, so on an HDR panel, I think we need, as institutional processes, need to understand the differences of each learning experiences of different disciplines. So, you know, work integrated learning for nursing is going to be quite different because we are looking at being safe for the public and being able to provide care at a certain standard, as opposed to other experiences within science or journalism where it value adds and helps us understand that real world knowledge. So I think institutionally we sort of clump work integrated learning as a thing that's, you know, just is meaning one thing. And so for us, and sorry I've lumped these guys in there too, looking at the notion of seeing work integrated learning as that we're not just doing it, but we're doing it for public safety and to be safe practitioners is different for a university to consider than just a passing student. So, you know, for me, that would be my personal experience of that, particularly that second question.
Yeah, thank you. Any responses to that?
I would make the comment too that there needs to be an understanding that there are different workload models involved in that. So it's going to take longer for one discipline, for academics in one discipline to assess, to support, than it may take others, but it might also be more intense in some periods and less intense in others. And that, I'm not really convinced that current workload models actually recognise that aspect of work integrated learning.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that particular comment that the workload associated with work integrated learning is variable, and is poorly understood, and in some cases it is actually very significant, and there aren't very good models out there to capture that. There was some work done by Anna Rowe and her colleagues at Macquarie at the time when she was there, around that. There's a publication in the journal, IJ Will, that explores that a little bit further, but it is an area that we need to look at more closely. And I think that's particularly important for us that are involved in work integrated learning, because often we carry a very heavy workload associated with it, but it's difficult to articulate that to our supervisor, our line managers as such. So we do need to focus on that a bit more. And at the same time, we need to look more closely at how we can minimise that by better processes and technology and using platforms and other things that can actually reduce the workload associated with that and streamline it to be more efficient.
I'm going to provide a little response to what you just said through, I think it's question 3. I can't quite see, it's the institutional and wider responses one anyway. Yeah. So,
no, go ahead.
Is it 3? 2, yes. So what's become really apparent to me over the last the disciplinary and the professional nuance can drop off. And so things like, you know, your specific professional requirements around sort of the inherent requirements or fitness to practice, the safety, aren't adequately dealt with at the institutional level. And it can be, you end up with tensions on the ground. So I'm kind of flagging, I guess, a key issue that I've noticed is that at the institutional level of strategy and policy, it's got to be about enabling and supporting. the really specific nuances around stuff like, educator requirements, workload kind of allocations, but also the pedagogic and the curricular kind of considerations. Yeah, it's a tough one.
Sometime earlier, I think when Carol Joy Patrick had similar responsibilities than Ruth has, we tried to find out a common will strategy across the university, and immediately we had issues because we'd go to nursing and you don't do will, you do clinical placements. Yeah. You go to medicine and they do their own thing. Teacher education, they do teaching practicums, and that's all will. And I actually get that, and I think that's important. We don't try and put something over the top, but it's the concept behind it which is important, but we respect the particular requirements and the particular processes that might be, pertaining to how will proceeds or clinical placements proceed in nursing, and then behind you've got people in teacher education, how that proceeds in teacher education. The only downside I saw in all of that was there was some immediate rejection of the idea of will without actually looking critically at practice in clinical placements or teaching practicums. Because I've worked in the Faculty of Education now for 27 years, and I'm not aware of anything that when the students come back from their teaching placements, where there's a structured experience where they get to sit down and share all of those things. And some of those students come back and they've had a pretty rough time in some of those placements. I know the same thing happens with nursing. Nursing, by the way, is an occupation that's stated to eat its young. So it can be a tough occupation to engage and learn in. Thank you.
My name's Nina Ginsberg. I've worked on a couple of the university internship, community internship and will programs, and I work pretty exclusively with international students, and there's a real gap there and a real specific kind of need between, academic, professional, personal issues and around getting ahead and getting confidence and genuine kind of experience in that sphere. So it turned out of a couple of conversations with a few of my students, we ended up developing our own, outside of the university, our own internship that was a full 8-week, 80 to 110 hours program over a summer that the students did with me, and I facilitated it, where they co-designed and decided what the assessment, what they wanted to focus on and all of that kind of thing. And it was incredible what they came up with, and they really wanted to work hard. And some of the activities that we did collectively was incredible work, but you can't find that kind of thing at university. It ended up winning an English Australia award as well, but it's not recognised by the university. So I just encourage everyone to be brave and be bold and, try new, radical, unusual, alternative ways of learning and living. And it was incredible.
Yeah. Good on you.
Yes, I was doing some work with the university in Canberra, which gives you a fair bit. Anyway, and there in the IT course, they had great difficulty placing the overseas students. And the domestic students were going off to do, work with high-end, computer companies and software companies. And the university, in its wisdom, and it was done genuinely, desperately was trying to find work placements, and the international students ended up going to work for not-for-profit organisations. And so they ended up in workplaces where they were doing things like changing printing cartridges, and in schools trying to overcome damage that students do to computers, school students do to computers. And although it was well intended to give them an experience, the distance in the quality of the experience that the two groups of students had was, so it's not just giving them an experience of some kind, it's trying to find a way of giving them sort of equivalent experience as well, and that can be quite a challenge.
And also as a follow-up, the students and I are writing it up to get it published as well, so they can get a publication under their belt, which will give them a knowledge that other students don't have. So it's really
Yes.
important.
Yeah.
They're the authors of their own learning.
Yeah. And And I think it's in those circumstances where the education institution needs to try and compensate for that. So a good example was years ago in a study with Flinders University in their social work course. It was great, their very strong will program. In week 2, the social work students went out on placements. But they had an awful lot of international students in their courses. And many of those students came from countries that didn't have a social welfare system, didn't have social workers. So you might ask, what were they doing in those degrees? Well, they were easy to get into, okay? But the point was that in week 2, they would be going into, social work. And so what they did at Flinders was put on a day-and-a-half program to orientate the international students to what a social welfare system is, what social workers do, how things work, to try and orientate them. It was very interesting though, because on reflection, what some of the staff said was that actually probably the Australian students should have gone through the same program, because the Australian students probably came from backgrounds where they had zilch engagement with the social welfare system. But that was an intentional effort to try and overcome, to try and promote the readiness of the international students to be able to participate in those activities effectively.
Yeah, sorry. If I can add further to it, I mean, certainly for our work placement program, and there's no doubt the same for others that run the work placement programs, as international students have presented a significant challenge. Especially in a scenario where the employer is the one that chooses the student, and they tend to be quite selective about who it is they choose. The way we've enabled it for, particularly for engineering, because for our program engineering, they have to do 2 placements. If they don't have 2 placements, they do not pass, they do not graduate. We've allowed them to go home to do their placements. Now, more often for international students, they tend to be quite well connected back home, and they're able to secure a good relevant placement. You just need to make sure and to enable that there are structures in place that allow them to be well supported while they do their placement back home. To be honest, I think most international students would probably prefer to do their placement in Australia or in New Zealand in my context, because that gives them a different experience that they want to seek out. But in lieu of having no placement, it's another way of making it happen. Another way we've made it happen as well is to have the students placed at the university itself. Now again, it's a compromise because it's within the educational institution, but the educational institution is a professional workplace, so there is other activities that occur there that's not necessarily just about teaching and learning. There's research and there's other activities. And that's been a way of enabling it to happen as well. Now I do know there is a proposed book chapter coming up in a book that's going to be worked through and hopefully published next year, that's going to explore the issues around international students and the challenges within. So hopefully that will give us some more insight around that. And the last thing I was going to say when it comes to publishing that particular activity, I encourage you to. It sounds like a unique and an innovative way of approaching things, and that needs to be communicated through the literature. So I encourage you to do it.
Turning the tables a little, I've got a question out of this. So I'm wondering, do we know of work that's being done at present around educating employers about the strengths that international students bring to work integrated learning? Are there programs out there to support employers with this kind of learning?
Yeah, Ruth, there is some projects and programs already underway. There's a project that I'm involved in personally. We're looking more towards students, but an element of that has been all funded by the Commonwealth Government. This is an element of that is also supporting employers to recognise opportunity. But there was also a partner project recently funded last year, and I'd have to go and dig up my paperwork, I've got it somewhere, that was funded deliberately to target employers around the benefit of international students. The government process around those grants was very much driven by a belief of the economic contribution that international students can make while they're here, and the benefits that they can bring to global connectedness when they return back home. And that was the underlying rationales of that, and expanding Australian businesses obviously overseas. So I could dig that up, I don't know where it is, but it was, Commonwealth Government funded program through international education with the Department of Education. So yeah, last year. So yeah. The government process around those grants was very much driven by belief of
Are there any more questions or contributions about the research stuff or any other matter? Barry.
Maybe just to sort of touches on number one, Carsten, perhaps directed to you. What's hot in the will area at the moment? What do you, as an editor, do you seeing as something that's evolving in the will space that you would like to publish?
What's hot at the moment is employability. Everything's about employability at the moment, and which is good. It's topical. It needs research, and employability is very broad as well. So there's a lot of opportunity within it. But there are four words that keep ringing in my mind that I think we do need to focus on more, and that's resilience, persistence, motivation, and expectations. So resilience, persistence, motivation, and expectations. I think those are four areas where we need to focus more on in work integrated learning. Those particular four terms are terms that are quite prevalent at the moment in discussions in primary school education and in secondary school education as well. And I think as a tertiary education sector or a higher education sector, we need to be looking at that further. So I would love to see more research in that area. But, we've kind of touched on it at one stage today already, which I can't quite remember when that was. And it was around expectations. Now, if we have clear expectations for students about what it is that they learn in the workplace, how does that advance their learning? Does that enhance their learning experience? Does that make it clearer for them? What are the expectations in the workplace itself? What are the employers' expectations of the students and their level of performance that they would like to see? It'd be great to see more work done in that area. I know there's a PhD currently being undertaken that's kind of dabbles with that a bit, but it'd be nice to see that expanded too. I think there's work required around looking at the quality of a placement for a student. So often there's a lot of placements, but the qualities are very variable around that. It'll be great to have some articulation and a shared understanding about what is a quality placement and then the impact on student learning. And I do think we need to look more at student engagement and work integrated learning as well. Students are engaging work integrated learning, but it's important that they're actually passionate about what it is that they're doing as well. That it isn't just a box that they tick because they have to in order to get their degree. So ways of enhancing student engagement, ways for us to be able to identify what it is that the students are passionate about and then having them do those particular activities as part of work integrated learning. I think that'll be really quite an interesting project to look further at. There's lots you can look at. If I was going to encourage any other part to focus on, it would be that to look at your own placement program, your own WILD program, and identify issues that are there at the moment and use that as a research project. Because if you're going to engage with research, if that particularly context is, if you're in that context already, you're going to find doing research much easier. But it also addresses an immediate problem that you have as part of your program. And it also ticks that particular box of having a research-informed practice. So you're researching a problem that exists in your own program and you're finding a solution for it. It's a perfect example of how research should inform our practice. I hope it kind of answers your question. Oh, good.
Can I just add to that you can pretty well bet if you've got that problem, someone else has that same problem. So why not do that research and share it through the journal so other people can benefit from your work and help improve their own programs, yeah.
Just a quick question, and I'm going to play my naivety card because I've been away for a year. So just a question around embedding employability across the curriculum. So this is probably more of a scholarship sort of question, and how we can use our WIL courses to strengthen, I guess, links to particular courses that have employability potentially embedded within them.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the
notion of embedding employability?
This linking.
Well, I'm just wondering if we have the capacity through our WIL courses to, I guess, capitalise on what's been embedded throughout a degree program before students then take on a WIL course. So,
yeah. So I'm a pretty strong advocate for a whole of program approach. So we've been sort of talking about this for a little while. I mean, of course, there's there's a tradition in higher education curriculum design for us to take a fairly atomistic sort of approach with, and I'm going to use Griffith terms here, with individual course or subject conveners creating the curriculum for their own particular course or subject, and then somehow students needing to sense make through the journey themselves until at some point, if they're lucky enough, they might have a work integrated learning experience, usually right at the end, with very little sense making afterwards or beforehand. So I think that we're actually seeing in the higher education sector a movement away from that kind of atomistic or unitary individual unit sort of approach. Instead, we're sort of seeing a move, and including at Griffith, towards a whole of program kind of design approach. And so what I would love to see, and what I am seeing actually increasingly, is program teams or degree teams getting together to discuss curriculum and to discuss how work integrated learning, other forms of experiential learning can be scaffolded throughout the program. So what does a meaningful pre-will experience look like, for instance? And how can we start to, if there's going to be a will experience in or near the capstone, you know, what do we create beforehand and afterwards in order to maximise the learning benefit to the students? If there's going to be a work integrated learning experience at the capstone end, we've heard a little bit about, in early areas of some programs, there may be a brief placement or experience, work shadowing, etc., that might bookend in some kind of way. So yes, I think that we are moving towards sort of a whole of program design, collaborative kind of approach. I know that we are at Griffith, and I can see it at other universities. So I'm feeling very positive about that, yes.
Can I talk to that in relation to the journalism program? So we started in year one with professional identity, where students start looking at their professional identity. And then for the last year and a half of their degree, we embedded, we looked at the core skills that journalists require. So that in radio journalism, we produced radio programs so that they were broadcasting them live on community radio. And then we scaffolded into television journalism that they broadcast on Bris 31, and then we moved online when they died. And then our capstone course was news production, where they produced online news the same way that the Brisbane Times or the Courier Mail did. So that was scaffolded throughout their whole degree, culminating in the capstone course, but they came out with a portfolio of published work, and then we embedded industry experience and engagement throughout those 3 courses. So they had a year and a half experience once they graduated.
Any final questions? I'm just going to ask, if there's not, I'll just ask the panel if they have any final comments to make.
Yes, I'll say something.
You're holding up.
I'll make it really fast. You should embed the research design in the course from the beginning. Don't try and retrofit.
A comment I would say about enabling research is not to be intimidated about doing research. I mean, often research is lifted up really high and in great esteem, and it's difficult to get to. That's not necessarily the case. I would encourage you to start with a small research project, look at and gain at your own program, and perhaps aim for a conference, a refereed conference proceedings paper, and then start building things up from there. Be part of a team. Working as part of a team, the research team is a very powerful way of doing the project, but also if you within that team has someone who's a bit more experienced, so you had an element of mentoring occurring, that's particularly useful. But research is important. It is research-informed education, and we need to adhere to that particular principle. And I would encourage you, do be involved in research and don't be intimidated by it. It's not as scary as it seems.
It can be scary.
It can be. It doesn't have to be.
Okay. So I want to affirm our practice here today. I think work integrated learning is incredibly important to the learner experience. Not just in terms of their employability. I know I'm an employability girl. But in terms of wider notions of student success and enriching student learning. So I want to affirm our practice. And I also want to say it's entirely possible to make those arguments for more space, for more resources, for more curriculum, to actually elevate the position of will in our degree programs, because the evidence is out there, and we can also club together and create more evidence. So start having the conversations with your leadership team, and don't be afraid to, bring out the evidence that you have, because yes, will is incredibly important to the learners.
Thanks, and I'll just build upon what Ruth's saying, and that is that to address the issues that Faith asked about the standing and will it be taken seriously, conceptualise your work well, and dignify it. It deserves to be dignified. My PhD was in how hairdressers learnt their knowledge. And one of the first papers I sent off that came back, a reviewer said, "Oh my God, hairdressers, what next? Vacuum clean salespersons." And the editor of the journal, which was Culture and Psychology, dismissed that comment as being worthless. And I think that's the important thing, is that while people might view this as being quite pragmatic, how we need to dignify it and how we need to give it substance, as Ruth's saying, is by using our science, our concepts, our ideas, that does justice to the important role that learning in different settings and how we come to reconcile that progresses. It doesn't cost anything, by the way. It's just reading and finding ideas that illuminate your work. So I think that helps translate practice into a higher order set of ideas which are accepted in journals and then accepted within instructional science and areas like that. So that would be my advice. Not that you asked for it, but I'm very good at giving advice when not being asked. Anyway, look, I'd like to thank Faith for organising it, and also your colleagues at Learning Futures who have organised things and done practical things like get us all together in microphones and things. I'd like to thank the panel members for their contributions. I'd also like to thank you for all coming along in very busy schedules and spending your time with us today. Thank you.